There is a kind of poverty that does not announce itself. It lives in the careful way a woman folds a letter before anyone else can read it, in the pause before she answers a simple question about how things are going, in the dress that is clean but has been clean too many times. Willa Crane was that kind of poor. And on a Thursday morning in the late autumn of 1883, she stood outside the county land office in Harlan Creek with a foreclosure notice in her coat pocket and the particular stillness of a person who has already decided she will not let anyone see her afraid. She had a ranch. She had 2 children who were not hers by birth, but were hers in every way that counted. She had land that her late husband had broken his back on, and that the bank now wanted back with the cold efficiency of men who deal in numbers and never once walk the ground they are taking. She had $11, and she had, though she did not yet know it, the attention of a quiet man who fixed things without being asked and wanted nothing visible in return. Some bargains are made at the negotiating tables of powerful men in rooms with oil portraits on the walls. And some are made at kitchen tables, over cooling coffee between 2 people who are too tired and too honest for anything but the plain truth of what they need. The bargain Daniel Holt brought to Willa Crane was not romantic. It did not dress itself up. A name on a deed. His labor on her land. The bank held off, the children fed, the winter survivable. That was all he offered. That was more than anyone had offered her in a very long time. What no one in Harlan Creek understood, and what the town would spend the better part of a year deciding what to make of, was that a bargain made from necessity can become something else entirely if the people inside it are the right kind of people. Not special people. Not people without wounds or without history. Just people who keep their word, who show up in the cold, who do not leave when the leaving would be easy. The town watched. The town talked. The town, as towns do, was both right about everything and wrong about what mattered. This is the story of what a name on paper cannot protect you from, and what it cannot give you, and what must be earned by other means entirely. It is a quiet story. It moves the way good work moves, without hurry, without noise, with the slow weight of things that are being built to last. It ends the way honest things end. Not with fanfare, with a coat on a hook and a fire still burning and the particular peace of a person who has, after a very long road, arrived somewhere they intend to stay. She arrived on a Thursday. Not that the day mattered to anyone in Harlan Creek, but it mattered to Willa Crane, because Thursday was the day the bank's notice had said, and she had read that notice so many times in the preceding 2 weeks that the day of the week had burned itself into her like a brand. Thursday. The word had stopped meaning a day and started meaning a deadline. She folded the notice into her coat pocket before she stepped down from the wagon, and she did not let her hand linger there. And she did not look back at the road she had come down. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It had a dry goods store, a livery, a land office with a warped front step, a church that leaned slightly to the east as though it had grown tired of standing straight, and a row of houses along the main street whose curtains moved when a stranger passed. It was the kind of town that knew its own business and everyone else's, and had opinions about both. Willa had lived 20 miles outside it for 4 years, which was long enough to be known but not long enough to be trusted, and she understood the difference. She tied the horse at the post outside the land office and stood for a moment on the porch. The step beneath her right foot gave a soft groan. The wood split along the grain and half rotted through. She noted it the way a person notes things they have no power to fix. Then she went inside and sat across a desk from a man named Burwell, who had a ledger open in front of him, and the particular expression of someone who has delivered bad news so many times that it no longer troubles him to do it again. The numbers were what she already knew them to be. The ranch carried a lien from her husband's final year, a year in which the water had come late and the hay had come poor, and Thomas had made 3 decisions in a row that a man with better luck might have survived. He had not survived them. He had left Willa the land, the debt, and 2 children who were not theirs by birth. Her sister Clara's boy and girl, left to Willa when Clara died of fever in the spring of '81. Owen was 7 now. Bess was 5. They were the reason Willa had made the 20-mile drive on a cold Thursday morning, instead of staying home and letting the bank come to her. Burwell told her the figure. He told her the date by which the figure was required. He told her these things in the careful, rehearsed way of a man who has learned that a flat tone discourages argument. Willa listened without interrupting. She asked one question about whether a partial payment would extend the period, and when Burwell said it would not, she nodded once and stood and thanked him, which seemed to confuse him slightly. She went back out through the door and onto the porch and stood in the cold air and looked at the street. She was 41 years old. She was not a woman given to visible despair, which some people mistook for not feeling things and others mistook for strength, and which was, in truth, neither. It was simply the way she had been made, or the way life had made her, or some combination of the two that she had stopped trying to separate. She felt what she felt in the way that water feels its way through a crack in rock, quietly, persistently, without announcing itself. She stood on that porch and felt the weight of what Burwell had told her, and she did not let it show in her face, and she did not cry, and she did not make any sound at all. It was while she was standing there that she first noticed the man. He had come around the side of the land office building with a canvas bag of tools slung over one shoulder and a short-handled adze in his other hand. He set the bag down at the base of the porch steps without looking at her, without acknowledging her presence in any way that could be called an acknowledgement, and he crouched beside the broken step and looked at it for a long moment. Not the way a man looks at a problem he is reluctant to solve. The way a man looks at something he is trying to place, deciding where to begin. He worked without hurry. He had a length of cedar board in the bag, already cut close to the right size, as though he had noticed the step on a previous occasion and measured it in his mind before coming back. He drew a folding rule from his vest pocket, checked the measurement, took out a small handsaw, and cut the board with the particular calm of someone for whom the work itself is a sufficient reason for being there. He did not whistle. He did not make conversation. When he had fitted the new board and driven the nails, he pressed the step with his boot to test it, brushed the sawdust off with the back of his hand, and stood. Only then did he look at Willa. He had gray eyes and a face that had spent considerable time outdoors and showed it without apology. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, perhaps older, the kind of age that is hard to pin on a man who works with his body and does not carry softness anywhere. He did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He picked up the canvas bag, settled it on his shoulder, and said, in a voice that was quieter than she expected from a man his size, that the step ought to hold through the winter now. Then he walked on down the street without looking back. Willa watched him go the way a person watches something that does not quite fit the category they would put it in. She did not know his name. She did not ask anyone that afternoon, and no one offered. She untied her horse, climbed back onto the wagon seat, and drove the 20 miles home through a sky that was the color of pewter and dropping lower as she went. Owen and Bess were at the neighbor's farm, 2 miles down the road, where she had left them that morning. She collected them on the way back. Bess fell asleep against her side before they reached the ranch gate. Owen sat straight and did not ask about the trip to town. He was 7, but he had the particular gravity of a child who has understood, without being told, that some silence ought to be respected. Willa put her arm around him without speaking, and he leaned into her, and they rode the last mile home that way. The ranch was small and tired-looking in the late afternoon light. The barn needed paint. The fence along the south pasture had 3 rails down. The kitchen garden was put to bed for the winter and showed nothing but dark soil and the dried stalks of what had grown there in better months. But the chimney drew well, and the walls were solid, and when Willa lifted Bess down from the wagon and carried her inside and set her on the settle near the hearth, the child curled up without waking, and the room filled slowly with warmth. And for a moment the weight of the morning lifted just enough to breathe. She made supper. She fed the children and put them to bed. She sat alone at the kitchen table for a long while after, with the lamp turned low and the notice from the bank smoothed out flat on the table in front of her. She read the numbers one more time. She turned the lamp down further. Some things do not get smaller for being looked at, but some people are made in such a way that they cannot stop looking until they understand the full size of what they are facing. Willa was that kind of person. She sat with the numbers until she knew them completely. Then she folded the notice, put it in the cedar chest by the wall, and went to bed. She did not yet know the man's name. She did not yet know that he would come back. He came on a Tuesday, 6 days after she had seen him on the porch of the land office. She did not hear him coming up the road, which surprised her later, because the road was frozen, and horse hooves on frozen ground carry a long way in cold air. But she was in the kitchen with the children, and Bess was talking in the particular persistent way of a 5-year-old who has decided that a question is not finished until it has been answered 3 times. And so Willa did not hear anything until the knock at the door. 2 knocks. Not loud, not tentative either. The knock of a person who is not certain of their welcome but has come anyway because the errand requires it. She opened the door and found him standing on the porch with his hat in his hands and the canvas bag at his feet. He looked the same as he had outside the land office, unhurried, spare, giving nothing away in his expression that had not been put there deliberately. He said his name was Daniel Holt. He said he had done some work for Burwell at the land office over the years, and that Burwell had mentioned, in passing, the situation with her ranch. He said he was sorry to come without sending word ahead. He said he had something to put to her, if she had a few minutes, and that it would not take long. Willa looked at him for a moment in the way that a woman alone looks at a man she does not know who has appeared at her door with knowledge of her circumstances. It was not a hostile look. It was a careful one. Then she stepped back from the door and told him to come in, and she put the kettle on, and she told Owen to take Bess outside to check on the horses, which was not a task that needed doing, but was a task that would occupy them for 10 minutes and give the kitchen some quiet. He sat at the table and set his hat on his knee and did not look around the room the way some men look around a room, cataloging what is there and what is not. He looked at the table. He waited until she had set 2 cups down and taken the chair across from him. Then he said what he had come to say, and he said it plainly, without preamble and without softening. He knew about the lien. He knew the figure and the date. He knew that under territorial law, a married woman's property could not be seized for a husband's debt without the husband's consent, and that the reverse was also true. A bank could not foreclose on a property held in both names without agreement from both parties, and that process took considerably longer than a single Thursday deadline. He was not a lawyer, he said, but he had read the statute, and he was reasonably sure of what it said. If she would allow his name to be added to the deed, the bank would have to begin the process again, and that process would take months, and in those months, a great deal could change. He would ask nothing in return but the use of the barn for his tools and his horse, and honest work on the land, which he was capable of, and which the land appeared to need. Willa sat with that for a moment. The kettle had come to a boil, and she poured the water and did not speak until she had set the pot down and taken her seat again. She asked him why. Not why in the way of suspicion, though suspicion was reasonable and she did not pretend otherwise. Why in the way of a person who needs to understand the shape of a thing before she can agree to carry it. He was quiet for a moment. He said he had been moving for a long time, one town and then the next, work where he could find it, no particular place that was his own. He said he was not a young man and was not looking to be one. He said he could see what this place was, not a wealthy place, not an easy one, but a real one, with children in it and a woman who was plainly not going to walk away from it without a fight. He said he found that he would rather be useful in a place like that than comfortable in a place where nobody needed anything. He said it the way a man says something he has thought about for a while and decided is true, and does not see the point in dressing up. She looked at him across the table. Some things are too large for naming, and this was one of them. The particular quality of a person who tells you the truth without making a performance of it. She did not say that. She wrapped both hands around her cup and asked him one more question. She asked whether, if the bank came back in the spring with different lawyers and a different argument, he would still be there, or whether his name on the paper was the extent of what he was offering. He said he had not come to put his name on a paper and disappear. He said if he came to work. He said she could hold him to that or not, as she saw fit, but that was what he meant. She was quiet for a long time after that. Outside she could hear Owen's voice and then Bess's laugh, high and sudden, the way children laugh when something small and unexpected delights them. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a low, steady glow. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cedar, and the particular smell of a house that is lived in honestly, without pretense. Willa turned her cup in her hands once and set it down. She said, "I can cook and clean, and I will not make it harder than it needs to be. But I want it written down, the terms, plain enough that neither of us can misremember them later." She said it without apology and without harshness. She said it the way a woman says something she has the right to say. Daniel nodded once. He said that was fair. He said he would have a paper drawn up, witnessed, that stated the arrangement as it was. A working agreement, nothing further, for as long as both parties found it useful and honest. He said he had expected nothing less and respected her for asking. They did not shake hands. The cup sat between them on the table and the fire burned, and when the children came back in from the cold with pink faces and loud boots, Daniel Holt stood and put his hat back on and said he would return at the end of the week with the paper and his tools. He thanked her for the coffee. He said good evening to Owen, who looked up at him with the quiet assessment of a boy who has learned to read adults carefully, and then to Bess, who said good evening back with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once doubted that the world is friendly. He went out. Willa stood at the window and watched him ride down the road until the tree line took him. Owen came to stand beside her without being asked, which was something he did when he sensed that a moment was larger than it appeared. She put her hand on his shoulder. She did not explain anything. There was nothing yet to explain. But she stood there until the road was empty and the cold had drawn the light down out of the sky. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, that the size of the problem in front of her had a shape she could work with. Martha Gill saw him leave. Martha Gill saw most things that happened on the main road between the two homesteads, and she had opinions about all of them, and she kept those opinions warm the way some people keep a fire, feeding them carefully so they would not go out. She watched Daniel Holt ride past her gate and watched the direction he had come from, and she folded her arms, and she went inside. She did not say anything yet. But the not saying had a quality to it that anyone who knew Martha Gill would have recognized. It was the quiet before a thing begins. The arrangement settled into the days the way honest work settles, without announcement, without ceremony, simply by being there each morning when the light came up. Daniel slept in the barn on a cot he had brought himself, and did not complain about the cold, which was considerable once November came down hard off the ridge. He was up before Willa each day, which she discovered the first week when she came out before dawn to start the morning fire, and found the wood box already filled, and the barn door already open, and the horses already fed. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with that information and then went inside and put the kettle on and did not remark on it. He did not remark on it either. It became simply the way mornings were. The fence along the south pasture was repaired by the second week. The barn roof, which had been losing shingles since the previous winter, was sound again by the third. Daniel worked with the particular efficiency of a man who looks at a property and sees not what is broken, but what order the breaking ought to be addressed in, starting with what will cause the most damage if left and working outward from there. He did not ask Willa for direction, but he told her each evening at supper what he had done and what he intended to do next, in a few plain sentences, the way a person reports to someone whose authority over the place they genuinely respect. Owen began to follow him, not immediately and not with any declaration of intention. It started with proximity. The boy would find reasons to be in the barn when Daniel was working there, or in the yard, or along the fence line. Daniel did not encourage this and did not discourage it. He simply continued working, and occasionally, without looking up, explained in a low voice what he was doing and why, as though he were thinking out loud and the boy happened to be nearby. Owen listened with the focused stillness of a child who is storing everything carefully for later. By the fourth week he was handing tools without being asked, anticipating what came next. And Daniel had begun to say thank you in a way that was brief and genuine and treated the boy as a person capable of useful work, which Owen plainly was. Bess was less patient about the whole thing. She decided within the first 10 days that Daniel Holt was acceptable company and began talking to him at supper, with the frank curiosity of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned that some questions are not asked out loud. She asked him where he had come from. He said a good ways east. She asked if he had a mother. He said he had, a long time ago. She considered this and then offered him more molasses for his biscuit, which was her established method of expressing sympathy, and he accepted it without making anything of the gesture, which was exactly the right response. Willa watched this from across the table and said nothing and looked back at her plate. It was in the second month that Aldous Price came to Harlan Creek. He arrived on a gray Tuesday with a good coat and a surveyor's map folded under one arm, and the practiced ease of a man who has made offers to desperate people often enough that he no longer feels the need to disguise what he is doing. He had interests in 3 counties, people said, and those interests had a way of expanding into whatever ground was soft enough to take them. He put up at the hotel, bought several men's supper, and within 2 days had let it be known that he had a figure in mind for certain parcels of land along the creek road that were, as he put it, underperforming in their current circumstances. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon. Willa received him on the porch, which was deliberate. She did not invite him inside, and the porch was a clear enough signal to a man who was accustomed to reading them. He was pleasant in the smooth way of men who have learned that pleasantness is a more efficient tool than pressure, at least in the opening stages. He named a figure for the land. It was not an insulting figure. It was not a generous one either. It was the figure of a man who has assessed what a person can be made to accept when their options appear limited, and priced accordingly. Willa said she was not selling. Price said he understood and smiled, and said the offer would remain open, as these things sometimes look different in the cold light of January. He said it not unkindly, but with a certainty that assumed the conversation was not finished. Only paused. He left without pressing further, which was its own kind of pressure. Willa stood on the porch and watched his buggy go down the road, and felt the particular anger of a person who has been handled carefully and knows it. Martha Gill had been talking for 6 weeks by then. The content of what she said shifted depending on the audience, but the shape of it remained consistent. That a widow woman taking a strange man onto her property under a legal arrangement was not a respectable thing, that the children ought to be considered, that there were those who wondered what exactly the nature of the arrangement was, and that she herself said nothing, but only repeated what others were asking. It was the kind of talk that is careful never to state anything directly, which makes it very difficult to answer. Willa heard it secondhand, through the dry goods clerk who was kind enough to warn her, and she received it the way she received most things she could not immediately change. She noted it, she put it away, and she went home and made supper. The night she found Daniel at the kitchen table was a Thursday, late, after the children were long asleep. She had gotten up for water and seen the lamp still burning and come to the doorway and stopped. He had not heard her. He was sitting with the bank's foreclosure papers spread on the table before him, and beside them a sheet of his own paper covered in columns of figures worked out in pencil, careful and close. He had his reading spectacles on, which she had not known he possessed, and he was running his finger down a column with the focused attention of a man who believes the answer is in there somewhere and is prepared to find it. She stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. There is a particular quality to the sight of a person working on your behalf in the middle of the night when they believe themselves to be unobserved. It is one of the few things that cannot be performed or calculated, and so it carries a weight that almost nothing else does. Willa stood with that weight for a moment. Then she went to the hearth and put another piece of wood on the fire and filled the kettle without asking whether he wanted anything, because it was cold and he had been sitting there a long time, and some things do not need to be asked. He looked up when he heard the kettle. He did not seem embarrassed to have been found there. He took off the spectacles and set them on the table and told her quietly that he thought there was a way through it. Not a simple way, and not without some difficulty, but a real one. The bank's original lien had a procedural error in the filing date, small enough that it had been overlooked, but sufficient, with the right argument made to the right clerk, to require a refiling. That refiling would reset the clock entirely. It would give them the better part of a year. And in a year, with the land producing as it should, the debt was manageable. He had worked the numbers 3 ways and they came out the same each time. Willa poured the water and set his cup beside the papers without disturbing them. She sat down across from him. She looked at the columns of figures, which she could read well enough to see that he was right. She looked at him. He was watching her with the patient, steady look of a man who has laid something down and is waiting to see how it is received. Not anxious about it, simply waiting. She said, "You did not have to do this." He said, "I know." He picked up his pencil. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, the wind had come up in the pines and the fire burned low and even, and the house was very quiet, and neither of them said anything further for a long while, and the silence between them had the quality of something that had been there for some time and had finally stopped pretending it was only silence. The clerk at the county office was a young man named Pritchard who took his work seriously and had the particular virtue of caring about procedure more than outcome. Daniel had ridden into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday morning in early December with the paperwork he had prepared and a copy of the original lien filing, and he sat across from Pritchard for the better part of an hour and walked him through the discrepancy in the filing date with the patience of a man who is not in a hurry because he knows he is right. Pritchard read the documents twice. He checked the statute. He went into the back room and came out again with a different ledger and checked something in that. Then he sat down and said, in a careful voice, that Mr. Holt appeared to be correct, and that a corrected refiling would be required, and that the existing notice of foreclosure was therefore procedurally void pending that refiling. He said it the way a man says something he finds interesting from a technical standpoint, and is also aware will matter a great deal to the people it concerns. Daniel thanked him, collected the documents, and rode home. He told Willa that evening at supper, in the same plain way he told her everything. What had been found, what Pritchard had said, what it meant for the timeline. The bank would have to begin again. The new process would take most of the following year. In that time, with the south pasture restored and the irrigation channel he intended to clear in the spring, The ranch would produce enough to service the debt on a reasonable schedule. He laid it out in a few sentences, without drama, and then asked Owen to pass the bread. Willa sat with the information for a moment. Owen looked between the two adults with the careful attention he always brought to conversations that seemed larger than their surface. Bess had her spoon in the molasses and was occupied entirely with that. Willa set her fork down and looked at Daniel and said, "Thank you." 2 words, said quietly and without elaboration, but with the full weight of what they were carrying, which was considerable. Daniel said, "It was in the numbers." He picked up his fork. The supper continued. Aldous Price left Harlan Creek on a Friday in mid-December without making any further visits to the ranch. He had stayed 3 weeks and made offers on 2 other parcels along the creek road and been turned down on both. And there was a limit, apparently, to how long a man of his type was willing to spend in a town that was not producing results. He settled his bill at the hotel, folded his surveyor's map, and departed in his good coat with the particular dignity of a man who has decided to be elsewhere. No one said anything to him as he left. No one had much to say after either, and the silence around his departure was, in its own way, a kind of verdict. Martha Gill stopped talking sometime in January. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way certain kinds of weather happen, gradually and then completely. Until one day the sky was clear, and it was difficult to remember that it had been otherwise. What changed was harder to say. Perhaps it was the sight of Daniel Holt at the church door on a Sunday in late December, standing with Owen on one side of him, and Bess on the other, and Willa beside him. All 4 of them in their good clothes, quiet and present in the way of people who belong somewhere and know it. Perhaps Martha had run the story to its natural end and found that it did not resolve the way she had expected. Perhaps she was simply tired. In any case, she nodded to Willa one morning outside the dry goods store, a small nod, brief and without warmth, but genuine enough, and Willa nodded back, and they went their separate ways. And that was as close to an apology as the town was going to offer, and as close to acceptance as it needed to be. The winter was hard, as winters in that valley always were. The pass closed in February, and the creek froze to a depth that cracked the near bank when it finally thawed. Daniel spent the coldest weeks doing the work that could be done indoors, mending tack, building a new set of shelves for the kitchen, repairing the cedar chest that had a broken hinge Willa had been working around for 2 years. He found the hinge in his canvas bag, a spare he had been carrying since some previous job in some previous town, and he fitted it and set the lid and pressed it twice to test it and did not mention it again. Willa opened the chest that evening and stood for a moment before she closed it. She did not say anything. He was not in the room. Spring came late, as it often did, announcing itself not with warmth but with mud and the particular exhaustion of a land that has been under snow for a long time and is only slowly remembering what it is. Daniel cleared the irrigation channel in March, working 6 days through cold that still had teeth in it. And when the water ran through in the first week of April, it reached the south pasture for the first time in 3 years. And the ground there began, slowly, to remember what it was, also. Owen helped with the clearing, and by that point there was nothing apprentice-like about it. The boy worked alongside him as an equal in effort, if not in size, and Daniel treated him as such. And Owen had grown 2 inches since autumn and carried himself differently, with the quiet straightness of someone who has been trusted with real work and has not dropped it. The debt was being paid, not all at once, and not without difficulty, but in the steady, accumulating way that honest work pays things, a little at a time, a season at a time, without drama and without default. Burwell at the land office received the first payment in May and recorded it without expression, but there was something in the way he set the receipt on the counter and smoothed it once with his palm that suggested he found it satisfying, in the way that certain kinds of order being restored are satisfying to people who deal in paperwork and have seen enough disorder to appreciate the difference. It was an evening in late May when the matter of what came next was settled, and it was settled, like most real things between them, without a formal conversation. The children were asleep. The dishes were done. The fire had burned to a low, steady warmth that was more comfort than necessity now that the nights had gentled. Daniel had his coat on the peg by the door, the outside peg where he had always kept it, the one that meant ready to leave, ready to be on his way, the coat of a man who is passing through. He stood by the door for a moment, and Willa was at the table with the account book open, and neither of them was looking at the other. Then he took the coat off the outside peg. He crossed to the inside peg, the one beside the hearth where the household things hung, where Owen's jacket hung, and Bess's small wool wrap, and Willa's everyday coat. He hung his coat there. He did not say anything. He went and sat down at the table and asked if she wanted him to look at the figures. Willa looked at the coat on the inside peg for a moment. She looked at him. She said, "Yes, if you would." She slid the account book across the table. He pulled it toward him and picked up the pencil and began to work, and the lamp burned between them and the fire settled in the hearth. And outside the night was warm and full of the particular sounds of a property that is being cared for. The horse shifting in the corral, the new shingles holding against a light wind off the ridge, the water moving in the irrigation channel where it had not moved in 3 years. The wind moved through the pines and the fire burned, and the horse stood quiet in the corral, and the smoke from the chimney rose in a slow, untroubled line into a sky that was full of stars and indifferent to the small human warmth below it, as skies have always been and will always be. The creek ran under the last of the ice at its edges, and the south pasture was green for the first time in memory, and the cedar chest by the wall opened and closed on its new hinge without complaint. The world continued. It had no opinion about what had happened in that house. It simply continued. The way it does, the way it always has, regardless of the names on any paper. And that was the story of Willa Crane and Daniel Holt, a woman who arrived at the edge of losing everything, and held on not by luck or rescue but by the particular dignity of a person who refuses to let go of what is real, and a man who had been moving for a long time and finally, on a Thursday morning outside a land office with a broken step, found something worth stopping for. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one. Next.